Hello. For the past 3 days, I have been studying the Star of Bethlehem, and I've spent a lot of time on this because it has become very clear. I am now certain that the Star of Bethlehem was on May 27, 7 BC. And the time that I'm giving here of 2 hours, 38 minutes, 39 seconds that you see here on this slide is the time of the new moon. There happened to be a new moon on this day, and I think that right around the time of the new moon is when this Star of Bethlehem becomes most conspicuous and important. So, and by the way, that's universal time. Israel, of course, is east of England, so it's in the early morning is when this happens, this Star of Bethlehem. And what I'm going to do is explain to you why this is the Star of Bethlehem, what the evidence is. And the evidence is very strong, and there's a lot of details. So it's going to probably take 2 or 3 videos, but in this first video, I want to get across the basic facts of what the Star of Bethlehem is and why this is the date. So this is exciting because this is something people have wondered about and debated about and explored. And with the help of modern technology and, all the information we have these days about how astrology worked at that time and the power of Google searches and all this stuff, it all comes together very, very clearly and extremely impressively. Okay, so let's get into this. Why? Let me say it this way. The evidence that May 27, 7 BC is the time of the Star of Bethlehem. So first of all, what is the Star of Bethlehem? I think all of us know this, but to quote from the Bible, now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. So these wise men see a star, which to them is a sign in the sky that the King of the Jews is born. According to the way it's stated here, they're so certain that they can read these celestial signs that they just say, like, where is he? We saw the sign, he's here, where is he? Okay. So scholars agree that the wise men are astrologers, and back in those times, highly educated, erudite people typically studied areas like mathematics and astrology, and they're referred to as wise men here. Okay, and then later on in Matthew, it says that the star came to rest over the place where the child was. So there's a star, and they have seen his star in the east. Okay, and then later the star rests over the place where the child was. Okay. Now, the date of the birth of Jesus is not stated in the Gospels or any secular text, but most scholars assume a date of birth between 6 BC and 4 BC. This is a quote from a Wikipedia article. So the academic research suggests that Jesus was born somewhere between 6 BC and 4 BC most likely, and I'm saying 7 BC. So that agrees reasonably well. I mean, they're not certain it's exactly between 6 and 4 BC, probably in that range. Now, I came up with the May 27, 7 BC before I read this detail about the academic research, so that confirms that this is a reasonable date. So we want to compare what the academic evidence is and make sure that everything is consistent and giving the same result. So it is reasonable that it could be 7 BC according to the academic research. Now the place, Jesus was born in Bethlehem according to the New Testament. And Bethlehem is adjacent to Jerusalem. It's on the west side of Jerusalem. So you see Jerusalem here in the south part of Israel. I have put a red circle around it. And there's been some recent research that there was another place called Bethlehem next to Nazareth. And Nazareth is north of Jerusalem, and it's 65 miles. On the right side of this slide, I brought it up in the Sirius software, brought up an astromap, and with the Sirius software you can click on 2 points and see the distance, and it's about 65 miles direct. Of course, if you're traveling by road, it would be longer than 65 miles. So, to quote from this article from NPR.org, Jesus was born in Bethlehem, which is adjacent to Jerusalem. However, this isn't a quote, but just to paraphrase what was stated in this article at NPR.org. However, Jesus is often referred to as from Nazareth. So this is confusing. Is he from Nazareth? Was he born in Bethlehem? Well, he could be born in Bethlehem next to Jerusalem and then live in Nazareth. But it was discovered that there was a Bethlehem close to Nazareth at the time Jesus was born. So he was born in one of these two places. So the scholarship indicates that Jesus was a real person. He's not a myth. He really existed. He was born somewhere between roughly 6 BC and 4 BC. I'm saying 7 BC, and most likely either near Jerusalem or near Nazareth. And as I said before, scholars agree that the wise men were astrologers. They also agree that the Jews were waiting for the Messiah. So Jesus was a Jew. He's in a Jewish community, and the Jews are waiting for the Messiah. When is the Messiah coming? When is the Messiah coming? And there was also a deep tradition to look at the sky for signs of what is to come. So even in the Old Testament it says, and God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. So you have this idea going all the way back to more ancient Babylonia that God or divinity reveals, gives signs in the sky of what is to come. So these signs in the sky are messages from the divine of what is to come. So the Jews are waiting for the Messiah. The astrologers, the wise people who can divine these things, can see. So can the astrologers see when the Messiah is coming? And these three astrologers say, yes, we saw the sign in the sky. When you put all this together, as I have in bold blue at the bottom of the slide, it is reasonable that astrologers will look for a sign for the coming Messiah. So what I'm doing here is I'm putting together the pieces of the puzzle of what was going on, that it makes complete sense that astrologers would be looking for signs of the coming Messiah. It all fits together perfectly. And based on that awareness that this is what's going on at this time and this place in history, that people are waiting for the Messiah, and some of them are looking for signs, because that's how you would know if the Messiah is coming or when, because God has signs in the sky. And the astrologers are the experts at seeing those signs in the sky. Then we can reasonably guess that the three wise men are astrologers of high standing. They come from the east, and they talk to Herod the king. So to have a meeting with the king, I don't think that three people who just happen to be traveling around, meandering around are going to get an audience with the king. So it appears, because these astrologers are taken very seriously, and Herod reacts very strongly to this news, like, oh my goodness, wow. I mean, they take these astrologers very seriously. And therefore, it's fairly evident that if we believe that the stories in the Bible are reasonably true, these must be expert astrologers. All I'm doing here is coming up with the most reasonable understanding of what's going on. We know they're astrologers. Scholars make that clear. It makes sense that they are. And from the reaction of Herod and the fact they get to meet with Herod, the king, they're probably astrologers, very high-standing, expert astrologers. Now, let's assume that the three wise men are expert astrologers, not just philosophers who see some pow thing in the sky and go, oh, must be, an omen that the Messiah is coming. That these are wise men. They're scholarly people. They are deep, religiously inclined people who have expertise. So what was astrology like around the time of the birth of Jesus? Well, the zodiac had been established about 500 to 600 years earlier. The zodiac that we know now of the 12 signs, it's been around. It's well established. It doesn't go back thousands of years before that. The historical evidence is that it was put together, let's say 500 to 600 BC. Many of the rules written down by Claudius Ptolemy and Vettius Valens about 150, 175 AD, about 150 years after Jesus is born, a lot of those rules written down by Ptolemy and Valens were already in place. Ptolemy refers to those rules. He was just writing them down. He didn't invent them. So by around the year 0, many of the rules of astrology written down by Ptolemy and Valens were already in place. And if you're familiar with those books, the rules are very, very detailed. Astrology is complex. It's not just, your sun sign, moon sign. There's all kinds of rules. The ruling planet of the zodiac signs. They use these things that later were called Arabic parts, where you add one position to another and subtract another, and you get a point in space. It's a set of very complex rules are involved. These are expert astrologers. So if they're expert astrologers, just like astrologers today or at any other period of time, they're not going to arbitrarily pick one weird thing that happens, like if there was a nova, an explosion of a star that creates this light. It's very rare, and it appears there was a nova around that time. Just like an astrologer today, they wouldn't say, oh, there's a nova, therefore something's going to happen. It would take more than that. They might say that. That's not impossible. But an astrologer has this complex rule book, and they would expect other indications. It's not, here's my point, it's not enough for an expert astrologer in the time just before Ptolemy and Valens that if there was a comet or a nova, that would be enough. There would have to be more. Now, if you're an astrologer, no doubt you agree with me. If you're not an astrologer, you may go, oh, I don't know about that. Well, we know. You study the Hellenistic astrology. It's complex. It starts getting complex somewhere around 300 BC with all these intricate rules. So, just putting the story together, there must have been something astrological that we normally think of as astrological happening. There may have been a comet as well. There may have been a nova explosion, but there must be something. These are real astrologers, So that's what I'm guessing. So the astrologers were the wise people of the time, later on in the Middle Ages, called mathematici, and they were experts in mathematics, astronomy, and other areas. I'm making reasonable guesses based on the nature of the times and the fact that the news that Jesus was the Messiah eventually spread around the world, right? Obviously. And If these were less respected astrologers, they would not have impressed Herod, etc. So the drama, the big stage of the events, the nature of the astrology at the time, the way that these astrologers were so sure that the King of the Jews was born, they must have had very strong evidence that this was happening. And you know that people like Ptolemy, for example, were intellectual giants. So these are smart people, highly intuitive, sensitive, devotional as well. But they're not going to just arbitrarily pick one thing out of the sky and say that King of the Jews is born. I'm putting together a reasonable scenario that is consistent with what is told to us in the Bible. If all of that is true, what else was happening besides possibly a nova or a comet, or maybe there wasn't a nova or a comet? What is the fundamental sophisticated astrology? And there was a sophisticated astrology. When I say sophisticated, if you don't believe in astrology, that's fine. I'm not saying it's true. I'm just saying it's sophisticated. The rules are very detailed. How did that work into it? Okay, so let's just use common sense. What I'm doing in this video is saying common sense from the point of view of astrologers, those of us who are astrologers and who have studied the ancient forms of astrology. We have a sense where we can think the same way that they did of what they would be looking at. First, number one, a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. I think anybody who studied the very ancient systems of astrology, from the astrological viewpoint, is going to agree with that. The Jupiter-Saturn conjunction happens every 20 years. In the very ancient astrology, Jupiter was the king. When Jupiter, every 20 years, goes around and meets up with Saturn, it's a change in the kingdom. This is mentioned many times throughout the Middle Ages. I think there's mention of it going all the way back very, very early. But in any case, the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, obviously a marker for change in the king. Not a massive change, like the King of the Jews, the new Messiah, or whole new era of some kind, but at least some form of a change of king. It would have to be reinforced by something else. But at a minimum, I think astrologers would expect the new king, the new savior, the new Messiah, however you want to look at how they were thinking of Jesus, major person, Jupiter-Saturn would be part of it along with something else. Number two, I would expect the star Regulus. Regulus is mentioned in the Babylonian cuneiforms as related to nobility. It's used today as related to a kind of regal quality. Regulus, one of the brightest stars, right almost exactly on the ecliptic plane, would most likely be involved. And I think the astrologers then, if you read Vettius Valens, and we don't have a lot of detailed astrological information before Valens, but it's reasonable to expect that many things would have to come together. Regulus, the king star, we would expect to be involved. Also, these astrologers are from the East, so they're going to be familiar with what we now call Vedic or Indian astrology. Jyotish, heritage, where the nakshatras go back, way, way back, one of the earliest parts of astrology, and associated with the moon, and Regulus associated with Magha, the nakshatra of being regal. So probably these astrologers are influenced by many traditions, or several traditions. There are 3 of them coming from the East. So these are deeply embedded ways of thinking astrologically. Magha, Regulus, the king, Jupiter, Saturn, the king. All I'm saying is that common sense, if you're an astrologer and you've studied these ancient traditions of astrology, If you were one of the wise men, wise people at the time, what would you be looking at? I'm just saying these would be the things that we would look at. All of these common sense assumptions, not going out on a limb, making wild speculations, end up being true. There was the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. It was exact on May 27. There was a new moon and a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, both together on May 27, 7 BC. Within 1 year of that 2-year time range, 2 or 3 year time range that scholars expect that Jesus was born. And we're going to see that Regulus gets involved, as we expect. Number 3, the emphasis on the east. Something about rising, something on the eastern horizon. Now, if you're an astrologer, you're thinking, duh, the ascendant, the eastern horizon? It's one of the most powerful, critical, important parts of the astrology chart. In Jyotish, the astrology of India, going all the way back, Western astrology, the ascendant, and the huge emphasis on the rising. And it's even stated in those little passages in the New Testament. And fourth, not only something rising, but when something rises, the sun rises, it then ascends towards the midheaven. You have this emphasis on ascending and then stopping overhead. This is part of the diurnal cycle of the stars and planets, obviously working into the story. So this drama of the daily movement of the planets involved in the birth. So all of these things are involved on May 27, 7 BC in Israel. It's specific to the date and the place. It's specific to the place. Because what we're going to see is that at the moment of the new moon, that new moon that occurred at whatever time I gave, we'll go back to it, all the way back, 2:38:39 Universal Time. That new moon that occurred at that time was rising in Israel. If you were somewhere else, if you're in what today is present day, Germany or India or whatever, the moment the new moon happened, it would not be rising. The new moon, on the same day as the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, is rising. In fact, let me show you the chart wheel. There it is. There it is. This is the new moon, May 27, 7 BC, at 2 hours, 38 minutes, 39 minutes, Universal Time. That's the time in England. East of England in Israel, it is sunrise. This is the moment of sunrise and the moment of the new moon. The new moon is rising. If we go, I'm in the Series 3.0 software, if we go to listing and we go to planet or asteroids positions list, we see the sun and moon, 4 Gemini, 12 minutes, 35 seconds. They're exactly the same position. This is the moment of the new moon. That moment of the new moon is in the same degree as the ascendant, 4 degrees Gemini. And here's Jupiter and Saturn near the top of the chart, coming to culmination. This is the change in the king. This is the new king at the new birth of the sun moon, approaching the top of the chart. And as the day begins, the Jupiter and Saturn will move up towards the midheaven, their highest point in the chart. Okay, as I get into this, it's going to get more and more convincing. I'm just telling you one thing at a time, that it is in Israel that the new moon is rising. We are guessing that these 3 wise men are real astrologers. They're expert astrologers who can calculate things with great precision. Of course, the precision they can calculate in the year 0 is nothing compared to what we can do today. But to the accuracy of today's calculations, they got it right. And we do know that they calculated the ascendant in those days. They had very good calculations. They had all kinds of gadgets, this Antikythera, or however you pronounce it. Anyway, they could do fairly precise and accurate calculations. And their calculations were good. They went to Israel to have the sun conjunct the moon exact. The exact moment that that new moon happens, they are rising in Israel with the Jupiter-Saturn coming to the midheaven. So it's not just the Jupiter-Saturn. That happens every 20 years. But how often will the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction happen at new moon? Not very often. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Okay, so these are the 4 things we expect. Now, there were 3 Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions in 7 BC because had the planets go retrograde and direct it. And it can happen 3 times. And it did in 7 BC. And as I mentioned before, this is close enough to what the academics have determined that probably somewhere between 6 and 4 BC was when Jesus was born. Now consider this very astute observation by an astronomer. I have in a blue bold font here. As John Moseley, an astronomer at Griffith Observatory in California, puts it, maybe it was something that required interpretation rather than something brilliant. Maybe, according to his astronomer, his guess is that maybe the Star of Bethlehem was not this spectacular light in the sky. Maybe it was spectacular to astrologers, to the people who interpret the sky. And this is exactly what I'm also thinking, is that maybe there was a nova, maybe there was a comet to add more to it, but you don't need to add more. As we look into the details of this particular Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, it was not spectacular visually. But from an interpretation standpoint, as an astrologer, it is spectacular. And that's what we're going to dig into. So Moseley's guess, this astronomer's guess, is very reasonable, that the 3 wise men were looking for the birth of the Messiah, that 2, Herod was concerned that they found the baby born at the time and place predicted. I've already mentioned this, that they got an audience with the king. These are very highly respected astrologers. People tend to believe what they come up with. And then later on, over hundreds and now thousands of years since the birth of Jesus, the story of his birth gets mixed up with mythology and people's imagination. And the news of the birth spread far and wide, suggests that it is highly likely that the expert astrologers were using standard, respected, sophisticated astrological theories of the time. It all fits together. That's central to my theory that May 27, 7 BC is the Star of Bethlehem. It's what astrologers would see as spectacular. Not visually spectacular, but interpretation-wise, spectaculars. So, astrologers in the year 0 are using an enormous number of factors to interpret, as I mentioned before. The ruling planets of the signs and Arabic parts and many, many, many things. This Jupiter-Saturn conjunction is special. We're going to see that Regulus does get involved, which we expected. These wise men came from the east. When they say from the east, they don't mean like the east side of Jerusalem. Some distant land. This is a major expedition for something extremely important. They come to Israel in search of the newborn king. Okay, now, let me say that again. This Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, in all 3 of them, in fact, not just the one on May 27, but these 3 Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions in the year 7 BC are not spectacular visually. I talk about this in a video, The Christmas Star in 2020. I made a series of 2 videos that are available at astrologydc.com. And I show in that video how the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction on December 21st, 2020 is spectacular. And it's because the difference in latitude between Jupiter and Saturn is, 6 minutes, or I think 6 minutes. They're almost right on top of each other. It makes for a brilliant, spectacular light in the sky, this bright star. It's actually two stars. And we just experienced that. If you went out and you had a clear skies just after sunset, you saw it. The Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions in 7 BC were not spectacular. The difference in latitude was about 1 degree, which is not close enough to make them spectacular. But I am agreeing with the guess. My guess is the same as the astronomer John Moseley, that it's not the visual that was spectacular, it's the interpretation that the astrologers would have. Okay, so another thing I'm mentioning here on this slide is that in addition to the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, the involvement of Regulus, how would Regulus get involved? Probably with Jupiter, the ascendant, or the midheaven. A lot of emphasis in the story on the midheaven, the stars stopping overhead, which would be the midheaven. Other indications of a new beginning, such as bright stars or planets on the ascendant. These are minimum requirements. Also, in the Christmas story, the story of Jesus' birth, there's all this emphasis on being born in the manger. And, they were traveling on donkeys and there were cattle or sheep or whatever around. Well, it just so happens that there are 3 stars in the sky, very, very close, within about a degree of each other, called Ocellus Borealis, Ocellus Australis, and Praesepe. Praesepe is the manger. Literally, that's, when you translate it from the Arabic, it means the manger. And Ocellus Borealis and Ocellus Australis are the northern donkey and the southern donkey. I am expecting that those stars must be involved, because the manger and the donkeys and all this stuff is so much a part of, you might say, the mythology, the romantic story that is so much a part of our souls, that's captivated us so much. Not because Ocellus Borealis and Ocellus Australis and Praesepe are necessarily important for the new king, the new Messiah, but they are part of the story. What we're going to see is that all of these elements are involved, all of them, in the May 27, 7 BC chart. Those 3 stars very close to each other are going to show up prominently. Regulus shows up prominently. The emphasis on the east, the new moon is rising, and the Jupiter-Saturn, all of the elements that I would think should be involved are involved on that day. Now let's think about this new moon. So every 20 years there's a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, which indicates a change in the kingdom. This one occurs at the new moon. Now, how often would this happen? That the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction would happen at new moon. When I run this in the Sirius software, I see exactly when the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction occurs, and exactly, we already saw when the new moon occurs. It's less than 6 hours apart. Using today's calculations, which of course are more accurate than would be possible then, they were within 6 hours of each other. So if we go 6 hours before to 6 hours after, how often would a new moon occur within 12 hours of the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction? Well, there are 29 days in the lunar cycle, and this is happening within half a day. So it would happen only once in about every 58 Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions. If you multiply 58 times 20 years, that's over 1,000 years, a millennium. Once in a millennium will the new moon occur within half a day of the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. So this is a millennial event. This is a very special Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. And how important is the new moon in relationship to these things? Well, let's think about it. Would the astrologers put a lot of emphasis on the new moon? Absolutely. The lunar cycle is extremely important. Extremely important. And I didn't think of it. It wasn't one of the things I listed in what I expect to be at the time of the coming of the Messiah. But in retrospect, yes, of course. It just didn't occur to me. The lunar cycle would be extremely important. And I would expect either new moon or full moon. In this case, probably new moon, because the emphasis is on birth, is on something new, it's like the annunciation, the heralding, all of this emphasis on new. Full moon is like the fulfillment, often associated with enlightenment, contentment, fulfillment. The new moon is the birth, the beginning. And here the emphasis is on birth, literally birth. Birth of Jesus and birth of the new era. So the new moon makes sense. Now the moon is in some ways the most important object in the sky, in the astrology of those times, more important than the sun. Today we talk about sun sign in the West. In India, they still ask people what nakshatra your moon is in. Or when they ask your sign, it's often the moon sign. The moon played a bigger role in astrology than the sun in ancient astrology. So let me read from the slide here. In some lineages of ancient astrology, the moon is more important than the sun, probably almost all of them. The nakshatras, which is, if you're not familiar with it, part of the astrology of the East, of India, and going way back, way before the birth of Jesus, the nakshatras and the emphasis on the place of the moon in the nakshatra was similar to our sun sign today. So today we ask what sun signs. The nakshatra position of the moon is more primary in Jyotish. The astrologers are from the East, and the Jyotish style of thinking probably spread all the way into the area of Israel anyway. In Western astrology, too, the moon was of fundamental importance in the kinds of astrology that were common. So the astrology in the time of Jesus was more involved with mundane affairs, changes in weather, the new king, less emphasis on birth charts. Birth charts began also around the year 500 to 600, as far as we can tell, when the zodiac was developed. There were birth charts. They are important, but a lot of emphasis on cycles. So the story of Jesus' birth is not just his birth chart, the way we think today. It's also his life, the life of Jesus, is an expression of the larger cycle. And we're looking at this as a cyclic development. A new age is beginning with a new Messiah, a new vision. And Jesus is the expression of that. So when we think about the Star of Bethlehem and the birth of Jesus, we're thinking of him as a messenger, as a son of God, as an expression embedded in the larger context. So we need to think in terms of cycles, developmental cycles, the Jupiter-Saturn 20-year cycle. And the most obvious, powerful, important cycle is the lunar cycle in ancient astrology. So that these two cycles begin simultaneously within 6 hours of each other on that same day is a synchronizing of the very fundamental flow of life, the two lights, the two bright things, sun and moon. Remember, the moon is more important than the sun in astrology. It might not sound intuitively obvious because the sun gives us life, but astrology is omens, signs from the sky. It's different from our physical life in some ways. The moon and its relationship to the sun, the birth at new moon, and the birth, the Jupiter-Saturn coinciding, which only happens 1 in 1,000 years. And I believe these astrologers knew that. The astrologers were sophisticated at those times. They could do very accurate calculations. This is well established historically. It's not just me saying this. This is known that they could calculate the ascendant fairly accurately, planet positions fairly accurately. So this is what's going on. When we realize the power of the moon and the lunar cycle and the coinciding with the Jupiter-Saturn, both conjunct at the same moment, this is the birth. This is something once in a millennium. And we're going to see Regulus get involved. We're going to see Precipe, the manger, which is part of the story, get involved. It all fits together. It all fits together with what we understood about astrologers at the time, about what happened. The story fits together perfectly. Okay, so the new start and the beginning of a new era. We're at 41 minutes. I'm going to find a point to stop here and continue with the next video. So this just summarizes what I've already said. The three wise men came from the east, looking for a star in the east. You know what? I'm going to pick up with this point. This is a little bit of a new point. I'll pick up with this in part 2 in a series of videos where we're going to talk a little bit more. We're going to dive in deeper to exactly what is happening on May 27, 7 BC, that makes it very clear that that is the Star of Bethlehem. All the pieces of the puzzle. I've emphasized here a lot of background information, put things into context, put them into perspective. In the second video, we're going to dive into the details of exactly what these charts are. We'll be looking at the charts and interpreting them and seeing the very strong evidence that this is the Star of Bethlehem. Okay, my friends, I'll see you in part 2. God bless. Namaste.